I think as soon as they put this group will sit, then we will start. Yeah. It's an fascinating. You just want to read and read and read in it, the book. I'd seen the manuscript, but I read it again over the weekend. I'd read the manuscript, but as a book, there is a flow to it.
Oh, I'm glad you like it.
Because when you look at the manuscript, you look at with a different eye. You say, okay, does this fit? Do we do this? Do we want to? But now this is the final. So. Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we are going to start. Before I forget, can you please close your cell phones because we have live webcast and it interferes with that. For our speakers too, if you have not closed your Blackberries, iPhones, iPads, whatever, please can you close it just for this hour? Thank you. I'm Hale Sfandiari and I run the Middle East program. It's a great pleasure to introduce Karen Murphy, who is an independent journalist and former public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, actually 2011, 2012. So she's a long-time reporter for the Washington Post. She's the author of Passion for Islam, which explores Islam's contemporary revival and the roots of religious extremism in the Middle East through the prism of Egypt. She received the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting and the George Polk Award for Foreign Reporting for her coverage of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and subsequently in 1990 and 91, the Gulf War. After leaving the Post, Carol spent 3 years in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where she continued reporting for the Christian Science Monitor, Global Post, and The National. While she was in Saudi Arabia, she started interviewing a number of young Saudis, men and women, and she continued with her interviews in the US last year and went back to Saudi Arabia. And the results of her interviews is a fascinating book that we take pride in having published, A Kingdom's Future, Saudi Arabia Through the Eyes of Its 20-something. We have copies of the book, but we decided we are going to distribute them after the presentation, and Carol will sign all the books for you. Carol decided that it would make much more sense to have a representative of that generation she talks in the book with us. And so we invited Faris Ahmad al-Suleiman to join us, and after Carol's presentation, he will ask a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor. Faris was born and raised in Jeddah. He's 22 years old, studying international politics with a concentration in international law at Georgetown University, and he has been interning at Human Rights Watch for the last year. I spent the last half hour talking to him, listening to him, and Carol, he's very articulate and full of opinion. So we are looking forward to hear Carol and then to hear Faris.
Well, thank you, Holly, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming on this miserably cold day. I've just recovered from a bad cold, so I hope you bear with me if my voice begins to falter. I'm going to start by describing a scene that I saw in Riyadh and that actually opens my book. I'd heard about a call for young Saudis who thought that they were charismatic, funny, or unique to come and audition for a TV pilot sitcom about a rock band. Now, auditions, comedy, rock bands, and sitcoms are not really the kind of things you think of when you hear the word Saudi Arabia. So I decided to go and investigate. The auditions were held in a Holiday Inn near where I lived in Riyadh. The hotel management, which did not want to offend the religious police, did not allow me into the actual auditioning room because I was a woman and everybody else was a male. But I spent the day hanging out in the lobby interviewing these young, hopeful comedians. Most of them wore Western clothes. Many of them were in jeans. One had his hair moussed into a stand-up comb. Another had a long ponytail, and a third had a diamond stud over his left eye. They were friendly, they were cheerful, and sometimes even goofy. And I thought they offered a very different image of young Saudis than the one held by most Americans, whose image, of course, has been shaped by 9/11 and the suicide hijackers, most of whom were Saudi and whose average age was 23. It was encounters like this during my 3 years in Riyadh that convinced me that the biggest changes in Saudi were happening among its young people, and that if we wanted to see where Saudi was going, we really had to look more closely at its youth. Then came the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia and other Arab countries, and the world's attention is now focused clearly on young people in the Arab world. This is why I decided to focus my attention on young people when I had my fellowship here at the Wilson Center. Now, I didn't approach this project as a social scientist or a pollster. There already are some good polls out there concentrating on Saudi young people, and they're mentioned in my footnotes. Instead, I approached this project obviously as a journalist. I wanted to offer context and background for the issues that are raised, and I wanted the readers to be able to hear firsthand from young Saudis in their own words. So what you have in this book is my assessments or judgments based first on my years of reporting in Saudi, and secondly on one-on-one focused long interviews with about 80 young Saudis, most of whom were in their 20s. I would have preferred not to do this, but I knew that I would not get candid answers if they thought their names were going to be used, so I promised them anonymity. Because the Saudi population is so conservative and tradition-minded and religious, I did my best to interview as many youths from those backgrounds as possible, and I did succeed in reaching a good number, as you'll see when you read the book. However, a few I tried to reach refused to talk to me because they dislike or distrust the United States and Americans. Obviously, there are young Saudis with deep hostility to the West and with more radical political views than the ones in my interview set. No one knows for certain how big a percentage of the population this trend represents. But after all my reporting, I feel fairly confident in saying they are not the majority and probably far from it. So now I'd like to briefly go through some of the findings of my research, and we can explore them more in detail during Q&A if you wish. First, some numbers. It's well known that 64% of the kingdom's 19.4 million citizens are under age 30. And for comparison purposes, I note that 41% of Americans are under 30. But I discovered another demographic detail which is really interesting, thanks to the research of demographer Richard Sincata. And this is it. The young Saudis I interviewed in their 20s are not the kingdom's biggest youth bulge. That designation belongs to their younger siblings, who right now are between the ages of 12 and 16. This age group makes up the largest percentage of the Saudi population, i.e. 12%. Those who are younger, who come after them do not represent as big a percentage because of a drop in fertility rates. I have a very nice image or figure for this in the demographic chapter, which shows you this portrait. So what does this mean? It means that in about 2 years from now, the country's most historically large youth cohort will begin entering the job market and higher education institutions. And that's when the unemployment problem will begin to really make itself felt. Education. Many young Saudis are really frustrated by the education they've got. Their main complaint was too theoretical, with no practical application, and too irrelevant, and it did not prepare them for the job market. Surprisingly, on another issue, despite the wide attention this is drawn in the West, my interview subjects were about evenly divided when I asked if they believed that too much attention had been given to religion. About half said yes, and the other half said no. I found that there's a real problem of a lack of motivation and boredom and ennui among young people because they find their classes at school dull and irrelevant, and because they're given very few opportunities for self-expression through extracurricular activities. University campuses in Saudi Arabia bear very little resemblance to those in the United States when it comes to student activities. There are no elected student councils in government universities in Saudi Arabia that I'm aware of. Now, although this sounds like a cliche, I cannot stress enough the profound changes in thinking and outlook that the internet and social media are having on young Saudis. This is an extremely connected bunch of young people. In Saudi Arabia, there are, at last count, 5.8 million Facebook users, and as of mid-2012, Saudis ranked first of all Arabs in Twitter users, with close to 400,000 tweeters. As for YouTube, there was a 260% increase in uploads in the year preceding last spring, and that compares with an average of 50% increase in the rest of the world. Now, all these social media users obviously are not in my demographic target area, 20-somethings, but a large proportion are. More to the point, according to one poll of youths in a dozen Arab countries, Saudis came out on top for daily internet use. 91% of those polled said they were online daily. Now, I was most interested in what this access was doing to the minds of young Saudis, and this is what they told me, that it's made them more questioning, more curious, and more able to compare their own lives with the lives of others, particularly other Muslims in other countries. They also feel that it's given them more freedom of speech, which they are certainly taking advantage of on Twitter. It's given them an ability to cross the strict gender segregation line to the extent that young people now have regular contact, chats, and conversations online with members of the opposite sex. Remember, this is something that their parents did not have. Finally, the internet has given them a tool for political dissent and organizing, and this was most visible in the 2011 campaign by women against the driving ban, when they announced and organized the campaign on YouTube, and then the ones who drove often took pictures on their cell phones of themselves driving, and they uploaded to YouTube, and then they tweeted that they'd driven. And this allowed me, as a journalist, to actually know with fairly good accuracy how many women had participated in that campaign on the first day. Now, moving on to tradition. Not surprisingly, these youths describe themselves as being less attached to tradition than their parents. What I found more interesting was that several young women told me that tradition and customs that put women at a disadvantage have to be delinked from religion because they are not an essential part of Islam. They pointed out, for example, that Islam does not say that brothers should have more authority than their sisters in family matters. Islam doesn't say that a woman who marries a man younger than she should be looked down upon. And Islam certainly doesn't say that women can't drive. And there's a delightful cartoon in my book on page 92 by a young Saudi female cartoonist, Hana Hanjar, that illustrates this point. As for religion, in this area I found a lot of ferment. Young Saudis want the kingdom's commitment to Islam to remain strong, but they favor a religious practice that's more voluntary, more respectful of differences among Muslims, and less enforced by the state. They don't have the same degree of religiosity as their parents, and they're more willing to question a fatwa or ignore it. There is more open discussion, mostly online, about atheism. And I would go as far to say that there is a brewing crisis of religious authority in Saudi Arabia, in that many young people have lost faith in state-employed religious figures because, this is what the kids say, they're too negative, they always stressing what's forbidden, they focus on trivial matters, and they fail to address the problems of young people. Many young Saudis are not only looking for replacement religious authorities, but they're searching themselves for new ways to interpret Islam. And for the past 3 years, a small group, admittedly small, of young Saudis has been meeting outside the kingdom once a year to discuss these matters. And they told me it would be impossible for them to hold their conference inside Saudi, but they thought that if they were able to, that their attendance would triple. Obviously, these changing attitudes pose a threat to the ultra-conservative clerical establishment. And this is one reason why some of the conservative clerics have been very vocal in criticizing the scholarship program that's sending Saudis abroad, because they know they're going to come in contact, that they'll have more exposure to other cultures and religions. Now, as for the religious police, which we Americans look on as a terrible invasion of privacy, you might be surprised to hear that very few of my interviewees supported disbanding it. They're regarded as a hallmark of an Islamic society. However, at the same time, they criticized how the religious police operate, saying they should be more polite and less confrontational and less focused on minor things like whether a woman has covered her face or is wearing nail polish. Several interviewees defended the religious police, saying that the media exaggerates the mistakes it makes in order to turn people against it. As far as politics go, obviously the Arab awakening has not played out in Saudi the same way it has played out elsewhere, that is, in overt street action. The biggest impact in Saudi has been instead on people's minds and raising political consciousness. One 19-year-old woman told me she thought, with some satisfaction, that the revolutions had made the royal family, quote, afraid of revolution in the kingdom, and as a result, she added, they're giving us more freedom. Some interviews cited greater willingness by people to demand what they view as their rights. One 23-year-old in Jeddah said, there's more courage from the youth to just demand things, whether it's right or a privilege or a dream. And he referred to the protests last year at a university in Abha in Saudi Arabia. He said, we never heard of these things before, but it makes sense. People just want things, and now they have more courage to demand them. Most youths I spoke to admire the protesters of Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen and Bahrain, but they don't want to imitate them in the sense of street protests. They don't see the need to, because many of them say they still hope that the royal family eventually, someday in the future, is going to voluntarily share power with the people. I found Saudi youths to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. They want change, but they prefer it to be gradual, step by step, so that won't jeopardize their safety and their security. And they're certainly not at this stage for tearing down the House of Saud. My analysis of where young people stand on politics goes like this. There's a large segment of young people who don't see any need for political reforms and who are disinterested in politics. They display a conspicuous lack of concern about political rights. They are content with how things are now, as long as the state continues to dispense financial benefits and promote an Islamic national identity. However, it is equally true that there's a smaller but significant slice of politically tuned young Saudis who deeply resent their lack of political and civil rights and would like a say in how they are governed. These politically conscious youths include activists from both an Islamic perspective as well as progressive or liberal perspective who see the West as a model that can be adapted to their culture. All of these would like to see gradual steps sooner rather than later towards a more accountable, transparent government, and many of them refer to the model of a constitutional monarchy. I think it's likely that this politically aware segment of young people will expand and will demand more participatory government. They may not call it democracy, but they will want reforms that give them more control, ideally one in which they share power with the monarchy. And if the growing numbers of young people heading into the workplace in the future years don't find jobs and have economic hardship, then I think this desire for political reform will grow. Now, there are a couple of the points that belong in the political category that I'd just like to make. Even among those who favor political reforms, there's a great deal of ambivalence towards elections because there's a fear that elections will incite civil strife and tribal rivalries. Across the board, King Abdullah is beloved among all youths, even among Shiite youths who are pretty angry at the government in general right now. When I asked my interviews what they thought was the biggest danger facing Saudi Arabia, many raised the possibility of factional infighting in the royal family that would get out of hand during the crucial period that's going to come sometime in the next few years when the older generation passes on the reins of power to the second generation and one of them becomes king. Quote, most Saudis are worried about the time after King Abdullah, said one 21-year-old. Inside the royal family, there's a fight. Everyone wants to be king. 3, or finally, the government has a problem with political prisoners. After al-Qaeda's violent campaign from 2003 to 2006, the government arrested a lot of people. They say these people number around 5,500. Critics of the government say the numbers are larger. The government says most of them have brought to trial, but these trials really haven't been open. And the fact that all these people are being held and the population believes they haven't been given fair trials is causing a big problem among Saudis for the government, and including young people. So in summary, when it comes to politics, the bottom line I see right now is that despite yearnings for political reform and a more participatory government in a significant minority of young people, there does not appear to be, for now, a critical mass of youth demanding reforms that would threaten Al Saud rule. So for the moment, and probably a few more years, the Saudi government doesn't face a generation of angry, rebellious 20-somethings. Now moving on to gender relations. I found a significant gap between young men and young women on this. Men say, yeah, they favor women being educated and having jobs and being in the public sphere, but they don't favor it as much as women do. And they really don't favor as much as women that the sexes should be equal in the workforce or the political arena. For example, I asked 20 of my male interviewees about women driving. Only 8 approved of it. And a preponderance of my male interviews prefer that their wives work in gender-segregated workplaces. Now, as far as women go, it's really astonishing that 50 years after women started to be educated, they now make up more than 50% of university students in higher education. All the women I spoke to want and expect to work outside the home. They have very high expectations about a career and about participating in society. They're also becoming more vocal about restrictions they live under. The driving protest is one example, and the female university students having protests last spring is another example. And yet, I can't honestly say that young women are agitating en masse for changing the guardianship system, which gives men so much control over women. There's a very vocal and courageous minority doing this, but I don't see a women's liberation movement in the kingdom at the moment. And one big reason for this is that women are divided themselves on how fast and what changes should be made. I do say, however, that over the next decade, women's demands will increase, and they will be a major driver of social and economic change. Now, as far as the Shiite youth go, I went to the Eastern Province and I interviewed them, and I had already known many of them from before when I lived there. I found them disaffected, alienated, and feeling rejected by their Sunnis peers. I find this is a very dangerous situation. The Shiites are certainly not poised for violent revolt right now, but they're increasingly angry, restless, and susceptible to those who want to stoke sectarian tensions. And even among young Saudis, as you'll see in my book, there's a great deal of prejudice towards Shiites. They've bought into the idea that Shiites are heretics and more loyal to Iran than to Saudi Arabia. Perhaps because of their feelings of rejection and discrimination, I found that young Shiites are generally more politically astute and sophisticated than the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia. Now, the wild card is students abroad. This is an unprecedented social experiment in Saudi history. As of now, there are more than 145,000 young Saudis studying in 30 countries around the world. About half are in the United States, and in this school year, we have over 71,000 Saudis enrolled in language institutes, colleges, and universities in this country. By comparison, when 9/11 occurred, there were a little over 4,000 Saudis here. And a few years later, that number had dropped to 3,500. The majority of the 145,000 are sponsored by the King Abdullah Scholarship Program. It's non-discriminatory. Women make up nearly a third of them that are here in this country. And the Shiites that I spoke to said they do not have a problem getting accepted into this program. My interviewees were divided in their opinions about whether these students, when they all begin coming back en masse, are going to have a big impact in the kingdom. About half said they thought they would, but another half said they did not think they would. I personally believe that initially these returning students will have more of an impact on the economy and in the business world than they will on politics. But they will want more say in how things are done in civic affairs, in their society, and in the economy, and they will want more freedom of speech. So what does all this mean for the future of Saudi Arabia? I think the next decade will be increasingly bumpy and challenging for Saudi leaders who will have to accommodate political, economic, and social aspirations of their young people. And because of their numbers, Saudi youth are poised to have dramatic effects on the kingdom in many ways. And they will certainly be decisive in whether the kingdom can transform itself into a competitive, globally connected economy, as the government says it wants to do, and a dynamic, creative society. Obviously, this transformation is going to require that young Saudis have a lot more intellectual freedom than they now do. In the future, I see a more diverse but a more polarized society, as more and more young Saudis question long-held assumptions and traditions. Multiple strands of thoughts on different topics are developing in a society that's long regarded conformity as one of its highest values. Indeed, it's already possible to see two Saudi Arabias. One is progressive, outgoing, very much at ease with global interactions. The other is inward-looking, extremely religious-oriented, and very conservative. These conservatives look at my wannabe comedians that I described earlier as Saudis who've shed their Saudi and religious identity, and they don't like what they see. It's possible that in the future this displeasure of conservatives could give rise to a militantly conservative movement in Saudi Arabia. Finally, I would note that up to now, Saudi culture has been designed to create new generations that are just like the ones preceding it. Children and youth are seen as passive vessels to receive the culture and then to replicate it. Simply put, this project is no longer tenable. Young people do want to maintain tradition, but they also want greater control over their own destiny. And a new template is needed for how the government and how Saudi society relate to youth. It would be one that gives them more autonomy and more avenues of self-expression, and that treats young people as partners in the ongoing process of the nation's cultural formation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Faris, do you see yourself as one of the young people that Carol described in the book, yourself and your friends, the people you grew up with?
Well, first I'd like to say that I'm very grateful to be here, to Carol and to the center in general. I haven't ever taken my opinions this seriously, so it's a pleasure that someone else...
Speak in the mic.
Sorry,
Okay,
it's a pleasure that someone else is, especially in a country that's not my own. My opinion isn't taken seriously back home, so it's nice to see that it's taken seriously here. And obviously it's very refreshing to see someone who's dug a little deeper, who's gone somewhere that frankly not many have gone before. The idea that well, scholarship generally about the kingdom, in my experience, is plentiful in the sense that there is a lot that's being written about the security situation, the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and that sort of stuff. But about the youth, not so much. And for someone to not just spend 3 weeks in Jeddah and Riyadh and consider themselves an expert, but to go to Qatif and Breda and Qasim and elsewhere and all these villages and towns and talk to people, that's really a great thing. And so from a Saudi, I myself am grateful. The other thing is, even though it's really humbling and flattering to be called the representative of a generation, it's hardly true. You spoke of the small minority. I'm probably amongst that small minority that whose views are not generally the ones that were depicted in your book. Even though I don't think it would be fair to say that any of them are inaccurate. Most of the stuff, most of the ideas I'm familiar with. I don't live in a cocoon. Even though I study at Georgetown, I was born and raised in Saudi. I just came back 2 days ago, and I spend most of my time amongst normal people with the views that you described. There's a really interesting section in the book. There's a really interesting section in the book where you talk about this youth movement called YIG, which is a really special and interesting group of people where we go into diverse neighborhoods in Jeddah and Mecca and elsewhere, and we interact with a lot of the people that you described quite accurately. And so just to go back to your question, am I one of those people? It wouldn't be fair to say that I would be. However, I'm nonetheless very grateful to kind of express my views and my opinions about a lot of the stuff that you've written about. I obviously have a lot of ideas. We've spoken on many occasions in depth, yeah. Once again.
So what did you disagree with in the book?
Well, can I start first maybe with what I'd agree with, and then from there we can we can kind of. Firstly, demography and studying demographics in Saudi Arabia is a very tricky matter. Firstly, because figures are very traditionally very unreliable, but it's refreshing to see that you've dug a little deeper and looked at a few different sources. And this is also stuff that's fairly new to me. a lot of the figures, for example, the idea that mobile and cell phone penetration in the kingdom and Twitter users is something that's incomparable with the rest of the region. That's something that's new and very interesting, and something that should be examined. Something that maybe I would kind of comment on, though, that there's in the post kind of Arab Spring era, and I see this in a lot of my classrooms and elsewhere in a lot of these talks that I come to myself, is that a lot of people talk about how social networking has kind of revolutionized the way the people communicate, and that's generally true. However, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, it really depends on how people choose to kind of utilize that tool. And we talked about this earlier today, and the really interesting thing is that in an open society like the United States, people use Twitter to kind of communicate and have back and forths. But in a more closed society like Saudi Arabia, people don't know what other people think. There's no kind of way to gauge whether other people have the same views as you, whether another person is as angry as you are about the corruption in a certain area of government or something like that. The only way to do it is kind of Twitter opened that door. And you explored that a little bit, and I think that's a great idea. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but the key is kind of how that social networking is being used, so there's kind of, for example, there's an interesting dynamic in Saudi where Facebook, in my experience, is used more to kind of break that gender gap. If people want to, for example, meet people of the opposite sex, they would generally use Facebook to do that. Whereas if they wanted to voice a political view or something like that, they'd use Twitter. And that's why Twitter is a very interesting kind of tool that's opening a lot of doors and kind of breaking through the one thing that, for me as a young Saudi, annoys me the most, and that's apathy, and particularly political apathy, and the idea that people are disinterested. And that's a theme, in my opinion, that should be explored much more, because understanding which direction that will eventually go in is kind of the key to understanding what will happen when that power vacuum you talk about happens, or what will happen when these several 100,000 students that are studying abroad come back. And so yeah, that for me is also a very important aspect. And a question I'd like to ask you actually is in your interviews, did you find that gap in the social networking, where some people using it for particular reasons and others for other reasons?
Yeah, I agree with the observation you made on the different uses of Facebook versus Twitter. I found that very few of my interview subjects were not online, and I can't recall one interview in which the word Twitter did not come up. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's an amazing thing. I find that as well. I find that even though I intern at Human Rights Watch, and even though I don't do a lot of work on Saudi, whenever I want to figure out anything, I have about 100. I have a list of about 100 figures in Saudi Arabia, from human rights activists to government figures and princes and different and other sources that I look into. And you talked about this as well. The diversity of the news that you can get from these sources is unparalleled.
Mm-hmm. Carol and Faris, why would the government allow this opening, this access to Facebook, Twitter, and so on, while in other countries in the region we know that there is a kind of control and repression?
Good question, and I do raise that in the book. I discuss that. It's a mystery. The only people I'm aware of who have been arrested for their tweets in Saudi Arabia, I can think of 3 people, and they were arrested for tweets that people complained were disrespectful of Islam, not for the political tweets. So, I mean, the red line right now, up to today, as far as I know, the red line for Saudi government on abuse tweets they don't like is if it slams religion. The red line has not yet gotten to politics. They are allowing, as far as I can tell, people to really voice things that would never make it on a Saudi TV or in a Saudi newspaper or a Saudi magazine. Why they're being this free, I can only hypothesize that, 1, there's really little way to control it, or number 2, as one tweeter said to me, I said to him, aren't you afraid the government's going to arrest you for what you're tweeting? He said, there are too many of us. So really, they would have to arrest a lot of people if they want to arrest everybody who's saying something political they don't like. The third thing is, maybe they're getting smart and saying, look, we can know what people are really thinking by reading Twitter, so let's let them talk. So Faris, I'd like to, what do you think is the reason?
I think generally that's a very accurate observation. What I'd say is that, and this is kind of also, if I was to have not a critique, but if I was to have a comment that would kind of temper some of the praise that I gave, and it's nothing about the research that you conducted. It's just the fact of the matter is, self-censorship is a very powerful kind of disease that I even have to combat when I speak, and it's a very powerful thing, and you see it in Twitter, and you see it, I'm sure, in the interviewees, and it's not only a kind of political self-censorship. It's a kind of it's a mindset of being moderate, and not kind of and the idea that an extreme is kind of unnecessary. Like for example, if you're asking an interviewee, and this is purely my opinion, this is very much subjective, but what I was saying is, if you're interviewing a young male and you're asking him about some of maybe the more patriarchal or chauvinistic tendencies that they might have towards, for example, his younger sister going out in public, he's not necessarily saying that he wouldn't allow her to do this or wouldn't allow her to drive, because he himself has reasoned out. This is my opinion. He himself has reasoned out that it is not just or is not fair for them to do that. Rather, he's thinking about, for example, more kind of, in a lot of circumstances, more shallow things to do with himself. How will his friends judge his sister? What will his uncles think? You know what I mean? Sometimes it's a much more micro level analysis, and this self-censorship that you see, you can also find on Twitter. If you notice, for example, and this is something we discussed as well, there are a lot of these YouTube channels. This is very wildly popular in Saudi Arabia now, and elsewhere in Egypt. But on Egypt, you can see it now on television. There are these YouTube channels that subtly kind of push the envelope in terms of what can be talked about. So there's a very famous YouTube channel called Atair, which is produced by U-Turn, which is a kind of small production company, a bunch of guys about my age, and what they do is they kind of talk about really interesting subjects. They might talk about arbitrary detention for a little bit and things that have never been talked about before. And the interesting thing is, though, for example, they'll talk about every ministry, and they'll criticize every ministry. They'll criticize the Ministry of Labor. They'll criticize the Ministry of Education, but they'll criticize the minister himself, but never if the minister is a prince, for example. You see what I mean? And that's nothing that's not unique to the YouTube channels. They're kind of reflecting a trend that you will see elsewhere, and in your interviews and on Twitter as well. People are not saying things that are wildly controversial anywhere else. There are about 5 people that say really controversial things, and all of them are on trial. We were talking earlier about Dr. Al-Qahtani, who's a very articulate and wonderful human rights activist, and he can say things that no one else can say. And the reason is because he has, I don't know how many tens of thousands of Twitter followers on Facebook. He's important. He matters. But generally, I think self-censorship is a very powerful thing, and it's a very important thing that we need to take into consideration.
Thank you. Let's open the floor to your questions. Yes, please just wait for the mic and then identify yourself too, please. Can you pass the mic on?
Thank you very much. Munzir Sulaiman with Al Mayadeen TV. You mentioned something about a generational gap between the princes and the generation gap between the youth and the rest of the country. What do you attribute not to have a popular movement in Saudi Arabia, similar in some fashion to what happened in the other Arab Springs? You did not elaborate on that. Is it because the government was able to give some incentives that the other government did not give? And we hear so much about the youth that they cannot find job in Saudi Arabia.
Karen?
Um, I think there are several reasons that there was not street protest by young people when they were going on in Bahrain, Yemen, and Egypt. Number one, the Saudis in general, compared to their Arab peers elsewhere, are better off financially. That's number one. Number two, they come from a much more conservative society. Number three, the Mufti had issued a fatwa saying street protests are religiously forbidden. Fourth, the government gave out a huge financial package of worth 130 billion of financial benefits, some of which were aimed directly at young people. But again, I go back perhaps to the biggest reason is this, what Faris called apathy among a large number of young people. They're happy with the way things are. They are not politically aware. They do not regard it as a big deal that they don't have the same political rights that people do in other Arab countries.
Yes, Carol, if I could ask you, Diane Singerman from American University. Gerda Lerner, the great feminist historian, just died recently, and she talked a lot about how contradictions of everyday life are the things that really move people when political action is really tough. And I wonder if you could perhaps identify some of the real contradictions that are facing young people and also women. For example, the kind of hyper-educated women that you're talking about, and the men who are coming back from abroad and not finding jobs. One of the constituencies you didn't really talk about were migrant workers. What about the sort of young generations of migrant workers, and not just as migrant workers, and we know a lot about their rights or their lack of rights, but the kind of contradictions that might come to face Saudi Arabia if oil revenues start dropping, or everybody talks about high unemployment, youth unemployment in the Middle East, but what happens when those hyper-educated women, when the hyper-educated men are not going to marry the hyper-educated women anymore? What's happening to the generations of women who, again, aren't necessarily marrying like they used to, or can't find Saudi husbands, but also can't find jobs? And so it's sort of that triple whammy of just trying to lead a normal life and doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And also from the religious perspective, what happens when we have these new technologies where people can meet online but not physically, but yet, of course, there's going to be a sort of influence on sort of practices of sexual intimacy and other kinds of things that are just contradictions. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. Well, first of all, when it comes to migrant workers, I didn't include them in my study because they are politically irrelevant to Saudi Arabia. They have no rights whatsoever. And I wanted to focus on the people that could in the future be politically relevant, and that is Saudis themselves. The contradictions facing women and young educated women are these. More and more women in their 20s and early 30s are pursuing careers if they can find a job. Unemployment among women is extremely high, but the government is working very hard to reduce this. This is why we had this ban on men working in lingerie shops, and this is why we have other efforts by the government to get women into the workplace. But it's not as if you have young single women living in an apartment on their own, and if they don't have a paycheck, how will they pay the rent, or where will they get food money? It's not there yet in Saudi Arabia. Most young women, single, are living at home with their parents. So if they don't have a paycheck, okay, it's not the end of the world. It may be the end of the world to them psychologically. And in fact, this is a very strong contradiction they face. But they're not going to be out on the street. Marriage. I can't tell you how many young, educated women in their 20s and early 30s are bemoaning the fact that there's no interesting men. and more than interesting, ones that they can trust who won't turn on them after marriage and try to use the guardianship to control them. Nowadays, young men say that they want their women to work because they want the added income, but they want them to work in a gender-segregated job. Now, in fact, a lot of young women don't mind working in gender-segregated jobs, but obviously, as the years go on, if you're going to have gender-segregated environments at work, that's going to very much limit the job opportunities for women. That's why I see inevitably, if the government is sincere about having a really dynamic economy that does generate employment and a robust private sector, I don't see how they're going to maintain gender segregation in the workforce. It's true when oil revenues start dropping, if they do start dropping, all these things I've said in my book are going to be sharpened. Desire for political reforms in this minority is going to increase. And there'll be more women demanding more rights for themselves.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Hala. My name is Saeed Erikat from Al Quds Daily. You mentioned the sectarian tension, how Saudi youth see, let's say, the Shia youth as being closer to Iran and so on. On the other hand, you have a great deal of anger and disenfranchisement. How do you see this sectarian tension playing out at the end?
Thank you.
Good question. Right now, there's nothing being done that I can see on the part of the government to win over the Shiite population that doesn't, that's not into this really violent demonstration. I think what the government, and actually I say in my book what the government needs to do to decrease this alienation is very simple, and it doesn't take big steps. Stopping job discrimination, allowing the Shiites to have their fair share of mosques and Husseinias, and allowing them to practice their faith openly everywhere, not just in Qatif, and removing certain figures who are treating the Shiites very badly. The king already did this once in Najran when he replaced the governor, and perhaps he needs to do it again in other places. But unfortunately, I do not see this reconciliation going on the part of the government.
Marina?
Yes, Marina Ottawa Wilson Center. I have a quick observation and then I have a question, Carol. And the observation is the situation you describe essentially suggests that the government at this point have no incentive to make changes, that educational reform is not in the government's interest, that any liberalization is not in the government interest, because the rather dismal conclusion that I reach listening to you, describing the situation is, it does work. That repression of, that strict control over the youth does work. If they don't want to if the older generation and the government more particularly don't just want to reproduce the society, essentially, they are doing a pretty good job of it. And I don't like it, don't misunderstand me, but it seems that's the conclusion. The question is, did you find any real differences between, for example, the bigger cities and the smaller places? In other words, can you say there are urban trends towards, demands that you see in urban areas that you don't see elsewhere? Thank you.
Let's take another question. Yes, the lady there. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Rita
Yes, ma'am.
Stefan with the State Department. I'm wondering about the civil society in Saudi Arabia as an alternative institution to the tribe, the religious apparatus, and the state authority. I don't know of any nonprofit, non-governmental organizations that operate, and I would appreciate you enlightening us if you know of any, and how do they operate, and how do they reach the youth? Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me answer those?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's two.
Marina, as far as your comment goes, I agree with you that the government has no incentive and has no desire and intention to do political liberalization. On the education of reform, they do want reforms. And then, in fact, they've already started it, and I discuss that in the book. They're just not going fast enough on education reform. The government is worried. They were very rattled by Egypt, what happened there, by Bahrain, and they're certainly worried about Yemen. And I would say the government is aware of all these flashing yellow lights on their horizon, the unemployment crisis, the rising political consciousness, the fact that women have to be employed and they're going to be more demanding. The government knows all this. What's into question today is, what are they doing about it? And it's not that they don't want to, it's that I think there's too much satisfaction. They're not rattled enough yet. As for your question, between urban and suburban or more rural areas, obviously the youth in the urban areas are much more sophisticated. They're more tech savvy. They tend to be a little bit more aware of the world and what's going on around them. But as far as political and religious views, I really don't see a big difference. I mean, I really do think the cities are full of politically apathetic young people that are just not politically conscious yet. I lived for 5 years in Egypt under Mubarak, and I saw then, and I wrote in my first book about how the government wanted total control of society, and this is why there was no civic society in Egypt. And I see the Saudis doing the same thing. There is no freedom to have NGOs or civic society. Let me put it this way. It's very little freedom to do that. They have allowed a small margin of human rights work to be done. And this group that Faris mentioned and that I write about in my book is a group of young people that really are a model of youth-driven civic activity, but they're totally non-political, they're totally, non-economic. They're into community service and volunteerism, which is wonderful. There is no civic society yet to speak of in Saudi Arabia. And if there were more, you would get both. You would get secular-oriented groups and you'd get religious-oriented groups.
Okay. We take two last questions together. Yes, there and in the back. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Howard Williams with DAI. I'm wondering about the growth potential for employment. If it happens to be around vocational and technical opportunities, if that might be beneath the aspirations of most youth. And if it is, if there's some role for social media in seeing vocational and technical jobs as being viable career opportunities for youth.
Okay. And then in the back I saw, Yes.
Thanks. Laura Schultz from USAID. Wanted to build on, Marina's question. In particular, any observations you can share with respect to how the Saudi government is looking at or potentially analyzing or not this demographic sub-trend that you've identified, the 11% of the 12 to 16-year-olds. Does it come up in discussion? Is it seen as an opportunity? Is it something ignored? Is that at all in the kind of conversations around these issues? Thank you.
I don't see much public discussion of the demographics at all. You see it among the government's aware of this, of course, but it's not like they're out on TV program, talk shows, talking about this and saying we've got a big crisis coming and we've got to work harder. They do talk about how we have to solve the unemployment problem, yes, but specifically that we've got this young demographic youth bulge coming up and all the challenges that's going to present. No, I don't hear that much. As far as vocational jobs go, there's still a long way to go to change the image of vocational work and education in Saudi Arabia. most young Saudis, you know, they're a little bit spoiled. They want a nice desk job that'll give them prestige and status and a good salary. They're just beginning to take jobs like a desk clerk, the front desk clerk in a hotel, or a supermarket cashier. There are some very forward-looking industries like auto sales people who've started vocational schools teaching kids how to be car mechanics. But it's a really hard sell to get a Saudi in there. But, you know, some are persevering. So, bottom line, there should be much more attention, public discussion on talk shows, you know, public campaigns talking about this. Because, you know, these guys, a plumber can earn a good salary. We know they do here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Forrest, you want to add something to it?
I was just going to say as well, my mother actually just finished doing her dissertation on exactly what you just spoke about, the idea of vocational training and the unemployment paradox in general, the idea that essentially there are between 15 and 20% of the population is unemployed, or the labor force, excuse me, but at the same time we have 8 million foreign workers in the country, and something that's kind of really strange to someone who's not from the country, but essentially there is a kind of sense of entitlement amongst at least my generation, the idea that if you're Saudi, you deserve somehow, or for some strange reason, a desk job like you just described. But there is kind of change in that. A new scheme that they've kind of rolled out in the last couple of years is that taxi drivers now are suddenly, a lot of them are Saudi. They're issuing licenses, and they have a special license plate, so you can even tell which one is Saudi and which one is not. So there is some progress, but you're definitely right when you say that there is much. The room for growth is definitely there.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Carol and you can pick up the book. Then Carol will sign it for you, and we are giving the book for free. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Not on the, as long as these people are, unless there is a reformist government like Khatam was. Like
I know. I got
oh, you look great right now. Thank you. 5 years have passed. Yeah, thanks a lot. Carol, there is a table, a desk for you, so I would suggest you go there, sit there.